Hello and welcome to Read Through the Word. Today is Saturday, August 17th. We are in the book of Ezekiel, continuing to work through the major prophets, and are in the book of Ezekiel today. Today our lesson is called High Places. And our verse for today is from Ezekiel 6:3. Proclaim this message from the sovereign Lord against the mountains of Israel. This is what the sovereign Lord says to the mountains and hills and to the ravines and valleys. I am about to bring war upon you, and I will smash your pagan shrines. I came across an article in the Archaeological Bible called High Places. And it was fascinating to me because as we're reading throughout the Old Testament, this is a subject that comes up again and again. And I always think, what were these people doing? What does this mean? What is this all about? And you can kind of get a general idea of it, but I wanted to know more specifically. All throughout Kings and Chronicles, it'll talk about certain kings that tried to get rid of the high places and some didn't. Or they smashed all the Asherah poles, but they didn't get rid of the high places. It seems like that's a constant thing that keeps coming up. And Ezekiel here too, he's saying, to the mountains and hills, to the ravines and valleys, I'm going to smash your pagan shrines. And there he's referring to these high places. So, what is a high place? The Hebrew word for high place is bama. Bama. And it literally pretty much means height. It can refer to a high place like a ridge or a mountain or a hill or a place of worship. So sometimes it might be referred to as a high place because it is geographically on a high place, such as a hill. But it can also refer to the construction of that particular altar or building. So like a typical high place consisted of a man-made platform or altar with associated buildings. So it could be because of the way it was constructed or the actual location on which it was constructed that could sort of categorize it as a high place. So this part was interesting to me, that oftentimes these high places where Israel worshipped were located in areas that were originally sacred to the Canaanites. So when the Israelites would worship at these locations, sometimes they were indiscriminately mixing pagan worship with worship to God. And God, as we know throughout the Old Testament, is continually trying to show Israel, I'm different. I'm different. Don't get mixed in with the way that people worship pagan gods. I'm different. And you need to set me apart. You need to show that I am above and beyond, that I am the sovereign God. I'm different. And like he spoke to his people directly. And he continued to show them how he was a God above all gods. But many of these high places were already sacred sites for the Canaanites. So when Israel worshipped on these areas too, it put them in danger of really getting mixed up in which god they were worshiping. Worship at these high places continued even once worship had been centralized in Jerusalem. And that was a big turning point where, I think the Israelites were trying to say, especially the leaders, look, this is where we worship. But even then, there was still worship at these high places in other areas. And the Archaeological Bible article says, this came to pose a threat to the purity of Israel's faith. It was interesting. It also mentioned Elijah might have chosen Mount Carmel in his challenge to the prophets of Baal because the site may have been sacred to both Israelites and pagans. So he was very possibly picking a site that said, You think you worship your God here. We think we worship our God here. Let me show you who's really God of this place. And, clearly it was the God of Israel. Gibeon was known as the most important high place for a time. Eventually, the ark was, brought to Jerusalem by David, but the tabernacle and the bronze altar remained at Gibeon. So that was still considered a somewhat important high place. So it's interesting that these high places weren't necessarily always like inherently evil, but the fact that the Israelites were not all coming to Jerusalem or coming to their place of worship as they should, the fact that they were continuing to sort of worship side by side with some of these pagan rituals, that's where they ran into problems. And we know that, looking into the New Testament, looking ahead, when Jesus talks to the Samaritan woman at the well, there's going to be a time, he says, when you're going to worship in spirit and truth, and it doesn't matter where you are. And so ultimately we know that all of the world belongs to God, and that the Israelites could worship God, wherever they were. But their choice to worship God at some of these high places that were already designated pagan places by the Canaanites was indeed threatening their purity of really focusing on the one true God. So it really came from their hearts in a place of, man, maybe we shouldn't be aligning our worship here with this pagan altar or this pagan place of worship, because God is different. Because our God is different. And he's calling us to do things, not just to be picky, not just to give a random rule, but to show us that he's the God of love and he's different and sovereign above all other gods. And I think today we can take note of things we might assume or believe, like maybe the Israelites assumed or believed that it wasn't going to be that harmful to be worshiping on these high places, sort of intermixing with some of the pagan practices. Maybe they just didn't really think it was that bad, or maybe they thought that they still were worshiping God, even though they had gone astray from the way God prescribed them to worship. And so I think the thing I thought of was, the things that we do are just as important as the things we don't do. The Israelites, it was very important that they didn't follow pagan practices or mix in pagan practices with their worship of the one true God. But it was just as important, if not more important, that they chose to do the right thing, to get rid of those high places that had become a snare, and to follow God by worshiping in the way that he desired, the way that he had shown his people. And that's true for us today too, isn't it? There might be times where we're doing things that maybe we shouldn't be doing, right? That we are not really aligning ourselves with all of God's love and truth. There's sort of some other ideas and beliefs or things we have mixed in that really did not come from God. And it's really important that we don't do that and that we see that. But it's just as important what we do. What do we do about that? Well, turn our hearts toward Jesus. Dig into the text of the Bible. Dig into good, reliable commentaries. Dig into, to finding out, what is God asking of me? Who is God? And what is the life that he's calling me to lead in response to him and response to others? So just like the Israelites, we have to take a look at what we're not supposed to be doing, but then we also have to turn to focus on, what should we be doing? How can we be loving God better? How can we be loving people better? Thanks, friends. It was great to see you today, and we'll see you next time on Read Through the Word.